Hello and welcome to this 1 hour Zoom webinar. This is part of the Great Northern Festival's Climate Solutions series. My name is Kyu-Young Kim. I'm the Artistic Director of the SPCO, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and we have a really wonderful hour of conversation and poetry and music planned for you. I want to start by acknowledging the ancestral lands that we're all on. I'm joining you from Minnesota on the indigenous land of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. I would like to invite all of you in the audience to take a moment now to introduce yourself in the chat, sharing who you are and the native lands that you are on. And if you need to look up the native land that you are on, we will include a link in the chat where you can do that. I'm getting a little note that there's no sound. So hopefully that's not the case. But I'll keep on going. We want to start this hour. This is probably the lunch hour for many of you. This is a time to take a breath, slow down, maybe hopefully in a nice warm place. And we'd actually like to start this conversation. We're going to be talking to Drew Lanham and to Gabriela Lena Frank, but we thought we'd start with some poetry read by Drew Lanham. So Drew, I invite you to read an excerpt from your poem, Wimberling.
Thank you, Q. To witness abundance in present tense, jaw dropped, gasping, awestruck by the ceaseless coming. So many birds. A few, one or two at first, then flock after flock after flock, then another flock. Bill to tail, wing to wing, clots of brown thrown into bruised, sun-tired sky, tossed northward by warm spring winds, stretched into undulating lines, V's, clumps, knots. Straight on coming, but then up and down, stitching hemisphere across equatorial seam, pulled taut to corners of the earth by tides urging. The skeins of scythe-billed beings passing by as fast shadows tremble, calling on every side. Arctic bound, but pluff mud and Atlantic sand satisfied here on this slender spit for now. It is the nearby far away. The dozen or so you've ever seen together standing stripe-headed, thick-legged in Botany Bay, salt marsh close by. Plucking tiny fiddlers, each scrambling for its clawed life, bits and pieces of those not fast enough, snatched up to become the thing that seeks them. Crustacean churned into Wimbrel, fat packing for the long haul, fuel for the short commutes. Now, you thought in that moment you saw the few striding the scene extraordinary. Could not stop watching the 12 because you could not imagine more. Could not believe that good could be better, could not believe that less might become more, as if your eyes beheld all there ever were. Then your scant thinking is joyfully raised to a power beyond dreaming. The clicker spins the sum up as incalculable, a feathered blessing, multiplied past tens or hundreds or thousands, or expectation of limitation. So many birds, but then your heart stops counting in mid-beat musing.
Thank you, Drew. That was beautiful. There's nothing like hearing a poet read his own poetry. So we were really blessed by that reading. Um, so can you tell us as we wait? I think Gabriela's about to join us now too. She can start her video. Um, we want to start with poetry because it just feels so perfect for this. This is not your ordinary Zoom. We're going to be unveiling world premieres of song settings that Gabriela wrote from your poetry. So, can you tell us a little bit of context for that beautiful poem or that beautiful excerpt from your poem?
Sure, Q. And again, thanks to everyone for being here, for being there. Thank you to you, Q, to the Great Northern, to St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, to everyone, to Gabriela, certainly, um, who is the creative force behind this. The birds are the inspiration, and these birds are Wimbrel, a curlew, and and a roost, an extraordinary roost of curlew was found off the coast of South Carolina, really not too far from downtown Charleston, South Carolina, that most people would be familiar with. Andy Johnson from Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but Felicia Sanders, the heroic biologist from South Carolina DNR, and a crew of others discovered this roost of tens of thousands of Wimbrel, potentially the largest roost, certainly in the eastern US and eastern North America, but a discovery nearby that seems so far away. And I had a chance to witness this spectacle for myself when Felicia and Andy invited me on to DeVoe Bank, this tiny spit of sand, this barrier island off of the coast of South Carolina, to see this miraculous spectacle of these birds coming in to roost at sunset. And it inspired this poem, written mostly, I must say, on the side of the road as I was headed back.
Wow, that's great to hear the inspiration of that. Thank you, Drew. You know, I don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions because we could easily spend an hour talking about all of your many accomplishments, but I do want to acknowledge that Drew is the alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology, master teacher and certified wildlife biologist at Clemson University. He's the author of at least two books, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, and Sparrow Envy, Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts. So it's a pleasure to have you, Drew.
Thank you,
And we
Q.
have, thank you, and we have the amazing composer Gabriela Lena Frank here, and we could go on and on about her amazing work, her life work. She's currently composer in residence with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She's just finishing up her first opera. She is the founder and director of this amazing place, Gabriela Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. And the SPCO has had a chance to commission Gabriela in the past, and we are so excited about this future commission that will premiere in 2024. This is part of this process of developing this piece that Gabriela and Drew are working on together. So welcome, Gabriela. Thank you for being here. And I wonder if you can start a little bit by talking, we spoke before the pandemic, it feels like ages ago, we met and we had a chance to talk about your work and what fueled your passions. And you talked about your identity, but you also talked about the climate and climate change. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how those two elements have inspired your work and how that brought you to this place of working with Drew now.
Well, thank you, Q. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you and Drew and everyone else joining us today. Um, as you know, Q, I live in California, and shortly before you and I began talking, I was still reeling from the experience of going through wildfire danger here. So I left my native Bay Area about 5, 6 years ago and moved 2 hours north into a more rural part of this beautiful and uh, pretty incredible state when you really think about it. Naturaleza is it's natural landscape. I think the first year of the fire, we all treated it like an earthquake. What's your earthquake story? And everybody's got an earthquake story. So it's almost a badge of honor. But then when the fire seasons were just relentless and were more and more grim, and um, thought I had enough to talk about as a composer with my exploration of my Latin American heritage that I was never going to run out. And then became reluctantly, I have to say, an environmentalist. I was a casual purveyor of nature, like many Californians are. We appreciate the beaches. We do farm to table fine dining. I mean, we do all the fun recreational things that are associated with appreciating nature. I love summer camp, but there's much more urgency to my views now, and there's no way that I can keep my music making exempt from commenting on that the way I do about culture. And the climate crisis touches every aspect of human existence. You can be exactly who you are and have the stories you need to tell that connect to your identity, your gender, your family experiences. And so you and I talked about that. And this was a brokered marriage in some ways, where I've had some of my best collaboration with writers and performers when someone else says, I think you two would really hit it off creatively and artistically. This is a BFF you didn't know that you had. So I've come in, and I've been able to begin this relationship and this friendship artistically and spiritually in many ways with Drew, and it's been such a delight so far. We had talked about also doing a stepping stone, so we are doing a large piece for your orchestra, which is a delight. I find that having a stepping stone between a creative team is a smart thing to do, where you start to hone your own special process as a librettist and composer. And so Drew was kind enough to give me an early draft. And speaking as somebody that worked with manuscripts all the time, I know what it's like to unveil your ideas when they're still forming. So he gave me an early draft. I'm looking at it right now of Wimbling. As you were reading, Drew, I was like, wow, he pauses here. I can do this with that next time. Or it gave me, you're performing. And so to make it land even more in a listener's ears. So that's something I can musicalize. I was taking note of some of the changes you made. And thankfully, the excerpt that I took for the two songs that we're going to hear today remain the same. So I composed two short songs, beautifully performed by this team that we're going to see, Ahmed and Clara, of just the opening words that I believe that we will put in the chat. The first block of text will be unadulterated, the way that I inherited it from Drew. And then the two songs are going to be two different ways of setting this text, and we'll hear both of those performances, and we'll see what I did with the text. And composers can get very tricky. We may want to linger on a word longer, or something else where our brain explodes with 5 different ideas and we have to commit to one. We can have commitment issues sometimes. We want to do all of the ideas. And this is part of the process of trust between a writer and a composer, that they can have a second version that exists in music. So so we're here Wimbling 1 and Wimbling 2. So what you see now in the chat is just the opening words as Drew first imagined them. And then we can hear the videos and see the text changed.
Abundance.
Wow, that was stunning. Someone wrote in the chat that they got chills, and the same for me, getting goosebumps hearing this again. I had the privilege of hearing this on our practice call. It's the only time I've ever been moved to tears on a practice call for a Zoom webinar. And so thank you for that. A couple of housekeeping things I should have done at the very beginning, which is I wanted to mention that we do have closed captioning for this Zoom webinar, and you can click the button CC at the bottom. And then this is not housekeeping, but I just want to acknowledge what incredible performances we just had from Clara Ozowski and Ahmed Anzaldua. We're blessed to have those two spectacular artists here in the Twin Cities, living here, of course, performing all over the world and all over the country. But Ahmed is the choral director of Border Crossing, a really important and vital choral presence here in the Twin Cities. And Clara often sings with them, but she also sings around the world. So two spectacular performances of that. We talked about having Drew and Gabriela turn off their video, but then I was so glad that Drew especially did not do that, because I got to watch his face listening to those two incredible performances. And so I'm going to start with you, Drew. So tell me that experience of hearing your poetry now brought to life as music. And we heard from your reading of the poem how musical you are and how there's a musicality to that, almost like a spoken word quality to it. But then having another artist working on this, what is that experience like for you?
Q, I forgot to turn my camera off, actually.
No, that's it's a happy accident.
Well, it's ugly crying face on Zoom. I can't. It's hard to find words. I don't think I've ever been as nervous about a reading or a piece, and just sort of this not knowing what those notes will mean this time, and hearing it in this setting with everybody watching us, Gabriela, and as you mentioned, this trust in what she, as the composer, was able to do with the words, and what Clara and Ahmed were able to do as performers, it took me to this different place. And I found myself breathing differently with each arrangement. And I had not, but my breath and my heart, I could feel all of that in a way that I have never felt it before. And so it was very emotional for me in a way I didn't quite expect, because I've heard it, but then not listened in this context. And so it's new life for those, it's new life for my words, it's new life for those birds. That's how I felt I was back in that place. And Gabriela told me, she warned me. You warned me, remember? You said that that this would change me. And it is every time. So I'm grateful to you, Gabriela, for exposing the great unknown in this. Thank you.
I think
Well,
for
it doesn't happen without great words. You know, the words have to have a lyricism and they have to transport you. And I've been in uncomfortable projects before where I just couldn't find it. And so, you know, composers with a skill set, we can do a nice setting. It's just nice. But I never would have thought of something like making the ending of the second setting into a bird call itself. I didn't come up with that alone. I saw it in the words and said, oh my goodness, so many, so many, so many. I can really play with that. So to balance that, then I would have a quieter, more chordal accompaniment that is almost trying not to move to scare the bird off. I was imagining you birding and just being, and you told me you're a very tall man. We haven't met in real life, so I'll take your word for it. But you must have to not move at all, and then to hear the music, the birds when they're just taking off or flying or they're singing, as opposed to the first song in which there's motion right away and it's got this really furious piano part that Ahmed's doing so beautifully, and simply on the word abundance to be able to repeat that over and over again. That's another angle in. And so if people were to look at the text, you'll see I wrote out literally every repetition, which word comes back. I probably could have done 5 more settings because it begins with the words. Then the music almost follows. It's almost easy. It almost just reveals itself. Um, and so it's a pleasure when I have something like this. I don't have to find a motivation alone in that way. It's like it's just handed. It just handed to me.
Well, it hits here. Um, and it's one of the ways that when I try to, I don't call myself teaching writing, but when I try to unlock writing from writers, um, that the hearing is important. I mean, it's one thing to write, and you do that in this imagining, and then you read it to yourself, but you can't fully hear it because the speaking and the hearing can occur, at least to me, in the same space. But then to hand it over, when I remember sending you, and one of the things that happened, Q, is that I think I was a couple of days late, Gabriela, sending it to you because I was like, maybe I should work on this a little bit, but what am I working on, right? What am I sending you? I have no idea how you're going. So I trust, and I sent it. And then you acknowledged you'd gotten, and then you went to work, and I didn't hear from you for a while. And so I'm sort of like, well, what's going on with this? Was it that bad? Is it just, and then to hear it and to be able to relive those moments, or to halt in the music or in the reliving of it, and to have you have interpreted it, and then to have Clara and Ahmed have performed that interpretation. And you said 5 more, right? that kind of blows my mind. But it's also when I teach writing, and I that first iteration is writing, the second is reading it back to yourself, and still you have no idea. And then I'll have people record what they themselves, and it scares people. And it's ultra scary to hand your words over to a different format, and you have no idea what's going to come of that. And I'm just so pleased, and I feel I'm privileged. This was such an amazing gift, to me, and to the world and to the birds, because I think ultimately that's who it's going to help in this climate challenged, habitat shrinking, socially injusticed world. Because these birds and these words will reach further. These are brown birds that maybe a lot of people don't notice, but now they'll notice brown birds endangered, imperiled, threatened in a climate change world we all share. So I'm just grateful, Gabriela. I'm grateful, Q. That's what keeps, that's like abundance. Just grateful, grateful, grateful.
Well, this is such a beautiful conversation already. I mean, Drew, what I'm struck by is your willingness to be vulnerable at this time where it's so difficult to be vulnerable, and that how that opens you up as a human being, as an artist, and that it leads to such beautiful collaboration and connectedness at a time where we need that more than ever. So it's really touching to hear that, and to hear you allude to the performances too. Like there's all these connections happening in this virtual way, but I think when we are able to do the piece in 2024, it's going to be such a joyous kind of culmination of this process. And for Gabriela, what I was struck by, I remember what a conversation we had at one point earlier talking about your creative academy, and just how virtuosity, composers can be virtuosic too. And that was such a display of virtuosity, of like, okay, here's a few lines of poetry, and what can I do with it? And I mean, I know you could almost say it's an exercise for you, of compositional exercise, or maybe a better word is your compositional practice. But that was an incredible display of compositional virtuosity, but for the sake of communication, for the sake of really bringing something to life in a different way. So thank you for that. That was really incredible. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the process and how teaching has become so important. I know for both of you, but how you do that, for instance, at the academy, because what we just saw, I feel like was like a peek into what you can do with your Academy of Music.
A few years ago, I founded an academy in my name, and the best piece of advice I got from an early sponsor was when she was asking me what was I going to call it. And I remember thinking something like, oh, maybe music table, music lab, a creative incubator. And she was shaking her head, said, no, you have to put your name on this. And at first I thought that was very immodest. And she said something about, first of all, women don't like to put their name on things. So you need to put your name on it. And that was it. That's what I needed to hear with that. But then she said something about putting your name on it. It's like putting your name on a piece of music. It's this, you will excavate your psyche for all the things you think are lyrical and important, and put it in this institution. And so I was able to set up, we're about 5 years old now, an academy that is literally out of my house. So people actually come into my personal space, and I show them my manuscripts, and I show them what works for me, and how I have put in much of my memory and my culture into my music. So I'm able to really take on a hands-on approach in that way. And because of the urgency of the climate crisis that has come to life for me in such a deep and personal way, it's now something that I want my composers to think about too. The majority of them are younger than me. And what I tell them is, look, you're like a superhero. You're a magician. You can clap out rhythms and sing and do all this stuff that's very impressive for non-musicians, for the larger public. And there's a kind of responsibility you have with that skill set that you have, is to think of yourself as a cultural witness, and to look at the stories that move you, and how are you going to use your lyricism and your ability to penetrate a text and pick out the corners, when you hold a jewel and it gleams at certain angles. Can you make that gleam in different ways depending on the setting? So there's a technique to it. There are technical things you can teach, but you have to cultivate the heart and the bravery to be vulnerable and to pick out the things that are important. They may not be something that gets you a prize or may not fit in with the music industry, but you might be surprised because musicians don't go in unless at some point in our life we were very romantic, very idealistic. That exists in all of us. And sometimes showing up and playing correct notes and doing our job, that can go away a little bit. But the climate crisis demands us to be the most vulnerable, the most communicative, and the most personal. So that's become an evolution very quickly of my academy. Um, and the academy experience always involves my composers coming to this beautiful natural part of the country. So most of us live in a very urbanized environment. And when we travel, we usually go to big cities and we see planes and hotel rooms. And suddenly my composers are driving past a fire zone, or they're coming to a town that's about 1,000 people. They're seeing me and my husband grow our own food, and we're trying to tend to the trees to keep them alive. And it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle. And they start thinking about their connection and disconnection to nature and how to put that into their music. It's been an evolution and a very personal one. And my composers have taken it and run. They're going to go farther than me. They're going to be able to reach people that I can't reach. They're going to come up with their own poetry and collaborators, and they will teach me in return. So this whole thing has been a transformative experience. And Drew, you don't know this yet, but I'm going to ask you to speak with my composers too, because this magic that you brought to me, I would love for them to experience as well.
Gabriela, well, yeah, thank you for that surprise. I, you mentioned so many things, and Q, you'd mentioned vulnerability, and in the midst of sort of where we are with the world situation at large, with so many threats, with being on the edge, it seems, of everything all the time, that music has always been, for many of us, an expression, but also an escape. And it can be both simultaneously. And so for these birds that are using this small spit of land, which to me is really important, because this spit of land, at times it disappears during storms. It just goes away, and then it reappears, which is something that I need to capture in the writing. But it I could feel it in the music, and in words that had not been written, but that Gabriela has come to understand in some sort of way. And then that this, for me, this expression of wildness has this purity to it, as it were, because the history of the coast of South Carolina is not a good one when it comes to my ancestors. And so, but this spit of land, this would have been one of those spits of land that in all likelihood never saw enslavement. But then the birds, yeah, right? Because it comes and it goes. It's shifting sand. And so, even though, my grandmother Mamatha would have said, you don't, her faith tradition told her you never build a house on shifting sand. The birds have found refuge there in a place that has always been free. And this music feels in a way freeing to the words. And it feels like that Gabriela and Clara and Ahmed were able to leverage the words into another realm. It's like some sort of tailwind, that's behind a bird that helps it, or lift that gives it a different sort of buoyancy and allows it to go where it wishes to go. So it hits in so many places for me. I cannot even begin to explain what happened when I heard it the first time. And then I had no idea that it would, I didn't know what the reaction would be this time. So I was a bundle of nerves, still am. And I'm just in love with this process of learning. I now know what a librettist is, and that and that I am one.
You are a librettist now.
So I'm now I'm greedy. Now I want to, I want to see what happens. I want to see what happens, Gabriela. I want to see what happens, Q. I want to keep going down this road of collaboration because it feels good and it feels hopeful in a way that, quite frankly, I've been missing with a lot of what's been going on in the world. So thank you.
I just want to bring it back. Thank you both to this idea that this conversation is part of the climate solution series. And so you think, well, what does this have to do with real solutions? But I think both of you in your work are providing inspiration, solutions for how we deal with this as artists or as human beings. You talk about the shifting sand. We're all on shifting sand right now, and so I think to just bring it home and to make us slow down and think about these things, to notice the birds, to know now I know what a whimbrel is. I didn't know what it was last week, and I was texting with Clara Ozovsky and she said, yes, I was in South Carolina. I saw a whimbrel, and so like these kinds of connections are magical, I think. And so we're over the moon about this. I know I see in the chat a lot of people are very inspired by this conversation too. I want to encourage people. We're going to save a little bit of time for questions too. So you can put things in the Q&A feature as well if you want. And we'll try to get to as many as we can, in a few minutes. But I do want to call to mind, how it started, Gabriela. We talked about this this theme of climate change, but also about birds. So what is your background with birds and reading also about how birds respond to this? I mean, what do you bring to it from that perspective?
Well, I saw an article. It was before the pandemic, and it was about mother birds. So the mother birds were changing their song to the babies that they were raising because of the forest, the landscape was changing. So they were imparting a different wisdom, a more contemporary wisdom, a more urgent and necessary wisdom. And it just stopped me in my tracks. And composers have a long and complicated history with birdsong, and there have been many attempts to musicalize birdsong with varying levels of success. And I think it's sometimes because we took a very technical, perfunctory view. We just notated down the rhythms and the repetition and the pitches. But we didn't think about what the messaging was, what was the deeper purpose, and it being connected to a larger spectrum of what's happening around the planet. And I said, "Oh my God, there's a story here. This is so moving. How can you not be moved that we're messing with Mother Nature's music? This is actually what's happening, and it's for their survival. This music is about survival and change." And I remember talking about that with you, and I think you ran with it and said, "Okay, let's see if we can give you a platform of some sort. Could this be the beginning of a relationship?" And I didn't know Drew's work until you brought him onto my radar. And I remember reading some of your articles, Drew. I think for everybody in this chat, reading the poem about birding while black, that I believe saw its first um, revealing on Orion. Is that right? Yeah, you can find it there. A more recent article written, I believe, last year about the Audubon Society. The founder, Audubon, is a breathtaking essay bringing together the issues of race and nature and legacy and art in so many ways. I would love to take some sort of multifaceted approach as I go deeper with Drew into all of this. And it started with just a mama's song, to little one. Um, Sometimes these things start from something very small, or seemingly small. But if you just stop and really think it through, it's very profundo, very, very profound.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriela, for sharing sort of the origin story for this. And I should also acknowledge the wonderful Kate Nordstrom, the director of the Great Northern, who, when we were talking about this piece and they wanted to collaborate, co-commission this piece, that she came to know Drew and invited Drew to be part of the festival last year, and so you're back for the second year. This is an ongoing process, so we're excited to see it develop over the next several years and to see where it can go. For orchestras, so often the process for commissioning new music is so, Gabrielle, you've described it as transactional, and rather than really authentic and really coming out of connections and building and letting things develop. And so this is we're so grateful to have this example of a different way, a different approach. And Drew, thank you for being part of that. I wonder if I invite you to also comment on what Gabriela was just talking about.
Q, this whole idea of collaboration, it's barter, really. And I think in the tradition, in so many traditions, birds have been inspirational, as messengers, as harbingers of freedom, choice. All of those things are embedded within. I try to embed those things in the writing that I do. But again, to have this opportunity, and yeah, shout out to Kate Nordstrom, because that first, I remember the first opportunity, and I wrote the poem Winterkill about ravens primarily, and from a raven's perspective, and trying to imagine the landscape. And I've spent some time in Minnesota with friends up in Duluth, and so I had to revisit that space. But then this was a totally different dimension, and I will tell you, it did take me back to my days as a high school musician and a bassoonist. And there was a time in my life when I thought I was going to be able to do that, right? And I didn't. But then there was this intention, I think, written somewhere, almost like the mama bird chanting to the baby bird frequently in the egg, right? We've learned that in that egg, those young birds are learning. And so I feel now like the shell is cracking a little bit, right? And intentions have been chanting through the shell for a long time. And those who sing to you, sometimes you never know. And so Gabriela and all that she's done with her academy, all of these influences that have been singing to me, it feels in many ways like a rehatching or some sort of fledging, to use the bird metaphor. And so her bartering this back and forth, it feels rich in a way that I never could have known it would feel. And so it's this gift that keeps getting larger in a way when I think of how it grows, and then people out there who get to hear it and think about it. And then we get to work on this for 2, I hope, more years. Gabriela, my surprise to you is that I've got plans longer than 2 years. So it's just to me, in this point in time, when we're all remote, we're all distant as we should be, there's this intimacy that develops, because it's like Gabriela inviting people into her home to learn the art of composing. You're here in my thicket with one thing away from being a hoarder's paradise, to Gabriela's place, to your place, Q. And even though we're distant, we're all in one another's space in this way. And that's the way art and literature can move into our spaces, into our hearts, into our heads. There's just so much to be grateful for here.
That's beautiful. And I think the number of sort of metaphors and the poetry of hearing you both speak is really inspiring too. I I am seeing some things in the chat. There was one question I wanted to address in the chat, which was, are you, Gabriela, planning to keep it as a piano vocal piece, or what is the eventual plan? So I know the answer, but I'll let you say it.
No, I've got the full resources of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra at my fingertips. So you're gonna hear the strings, and you're gonna hear cue, and you're gonna hear percussion, brasses, winds, and a solo singer will be at the helm. So it will be up to me and Drew to be able to really inhabit a much fuller universe. And as I was saying, this was just a stepping stone just for us to start finding our process and the lyricism and um, an exploration of what the words are capable of. And this will continue. And then part of the process will be that the orchestra will be giving me readings. Um, my secret, well, it's not so secret now, but my secret weakness is I feel less comfort writing for brasses, and I feel a great deal of comfort writing for strings and winds. And I have a career in major substance, and I think it's very important for artists to keep assessing where they can continue to learn. And so I remember going to Q and saying right off, I want a smaller session, a work session with just your brass players first. Then we'll do a second reading if you're open to this with the full orchestra. And I think we need to bring the whole collaborative process, not just between writers and composers, but into even the really large world of the orchestra. And I think this will be a really wonderful project. It's an incredible opportunity for me to have readings of large ensemble works, and it's not common. It's rather uncommon, so I'm very grateful for that. So, Drew, if you thought this was, sonically like, and it is powerful, but the orchestra has its own particular kind of power as well.
Right, and I do want to step in and just acknowledge that, to be able to do that, I mean, we're so grateful to you for being willing to do that, but we have some very generous donors who've been able to make that possible. So Jay and Elizabeth Schlichting, who have commissioned the piece and the lead commissioners, and very supportive of this workshopping process, have made that possible. So I give a shout out to the Schlichtings. I'm also seeing in the chat that people want to hear the poem one more time. So I think that could be a really beautiful way to end. Let's leave like the last few minutes for that. I do want to ask one more question of both of you, which, since this is part of the climate solution series, maybe for you to talk a little bit to someone who's interested in the environment, maybe feels like, well, what can I do? Or, what kind of advice could you give to someone about how they can be part of the solution to these incredible challenges we face?
There was back in the day, there was this bumper sticker, think globally, act locally. And I think sometimes when people hear those two words, climate change, they say, oh my, well, what can I do? And there's plenty that you can do in your neighborhood. Wildness is not some faraway place. Wildness is often the thing that others call weeds that you can choose to call a wildflower. And so you have to look sometimes between the cracks of a sidewalk or in the asphalt or in an abandoned city lot or in a corner park, and find your solution there, to make where you are better. And that can be with your hands in the soil. It can be with your hands on the page. It can be you using your voice to sing or blow out notes that cause others to think and feel. And so I think sometimes we underestimate the power of inspiration in change. And change, no substantial change ever happens without inspiration. And this, and what Gabriela and the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and you, Q and Kate, have given me is inspiration to do more, And so to find what you have where you are to leverage it into action, which begins with thinking and feeling, do that.
That was a beautiful answer to not such a good question, but I'll also invite Gabriela to go as well.
Oh, when I talk with my composers that are in one of our programs called Composing Earth, which is a 2-year commitment on their part, they spend the first year in a monthly study group. We give them a study stipend and we read certain books, watch certain documentaries. Many of them are coming to this question for the first time. And there's almost a grieving process you go through first. I think if you become an environmentalist, you become rather intimate with grief. And that's part of the process. And we try to help them through that. And then a sense of powerlessness when you think about the huge systems that are in play. That's very hard for a single individual to combat. Um, and then once you go through that, I talk about this with your family first. Talk about with the friends in your life, and even if it's just to say, "I'm concerned, I'm scared," or "What do you think of this? What do you think of that?" It's good practice for as an art citizen for when you want to embrace a larger platform. And my spirit is such that I get out of my feeling of despair when I have something very practical to do, and there's a combination of the inspiration and the practical doing something. And now I'm writing for the orchestra and I have a much bigger platform, and there can be the technical as well in terms of how giving interviews or changing your lifestyle. Can you commit to not flying so much anymore, especially for us musicians to have such a nomadic lifestyle? That's a real conundrum for us to face, but it means making these steps and actually always moving forward. And I have found that I have a greater demand on my skill sets as a musician, lyrically, poetically, as well as technically now than I did before I became an environmentalist. I have to reach people that may not be impressed by a fancy bio, that have very pressing concerns in their life. Why should they take an hour out and listen to these messages? So I think you start with what you have and you take one step from there, but you have to keep moving. We don't have a lot of time. You do have to keep moving and to take breaks from the grieving that you're going to feel and to take care of your emotional and mental well-being. But then to avail yourselves of the kind of people that are out there like Drew and so many others. It's hard not to feel courageous. It's hard not to feel imbued with a certain spirit of action when you see others are doing it. You want to get closer to that. So it's a wonderful question, and paralysis is not an option here, artistically, practically, or any other mode.
Well, thank you both. Those are really inspiring words and very constructive. I remember, Gabriela, you talked about moving away from this feeling of panic and actually thinking about, constructive solutions. And those are both, wonderful words of advice. Um, I wonder if we can just end, Drew, with, can you read the poem one more time? Do you have it up? I think people were asking for that in the chat. And I think it would be a really beautiful way to bring this full circle and then send people off on their day. Oh, you're muted now, Drew.
How about if I finish it?
Oh, one even better. That sounds great. And well, you can do that. And thank you everybody for joining us for this beautiful conversation. Thank you to the Great Northern and the wonderful team that Kate has assembled to make this webinar happen. And there's so many great offerings that they have for these next week and a half or so. And keep your eyes out and ears out for this new project coming down the road with Gabriela and Drew. So take it away, Drew.
But then your heart stops in mid-beat musing. In the pause between endless passage, these wild dreams suspended by reality gone by, you breathe without asking to have it, exhaling to remember in past tense, of the current miracle witnessed, what it was like when the skies grew dark under the wings of birds with wistful names, knots, plovers, pipers, peeps, oyster catchers, skimmers, too many to count, like passenger pigeons or Carolina parakeets or Eskimo curlews, so many birds. Someone once thought the number they saw uncountable in their own present tense, without future conditional in mind. Past is present again suddenly. Cardiac arrest restarts as another scheme passes. It seems not so much counting as stratified random guessing. Long since run through fingers and toes, I stop, afraid to blink or move as thousands of flesh, feather, and bone monuments call to hope. Love answers back. I blink as the tide reaches the corners of my eyes. I leave estimates to less stunned, more skilled, the first believer who saw in the awed silence, bow my head, vow, we will do better, Wimbrel, I promise.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Gabriela. It was a wonderful hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Take care.